Okay. So as we virtually gather here today, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. I've lived in Saskatoon for nearly a decade now, and I'm privileged to enjoy the beautiful lands and people within Treaty 4 and 6. And I pay my respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another, all of us who live here and are part of the Treaty Nations. I would like to invite all of you to share in the chat your affiliation, where you're joining from, and also if you would like to acknowledge which territories you are in, and then also to just take a silent moment to reflect on your relationship to the land, to those who came before us and to those who will follow. And while you're doing that, I will give a little bit of information here about the webinar and about the research that we are engaged in. So the project, the webinar is part of a project called Transforming Emergency Response in First Nations and Métis Communities in the Time of COVID-19 through Gender and Cultural Safety. This project is headed up by Dr. Caroline Tate and Dr. Simon Lambert, both of whom are here with us today. We'll be hearing from Dr. Lambert later. And we want to acknowledge the funding that is supporting this project from the TD Bank Group's TD Ready Challenge. This is a 3-year project, and you can see there we've got some activities planned centering on the idea of gender and cultural safety in emergency response. And with that, I would like to invite Dr. Caroline Tate to share some welcoming words.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. And I'm up at my home. I live up in near the National Park in Saskatchewan, in beautiful, beautiful country up here. I'm surrounded by not only forest, but also I live with elk and deer running around near my house all the time. I'm on Treaty 6, and also as a Métis person, this is part of our homeland. And so I'm very, very happy to be back. I say it's north, it's actually north, it's central Saskatchewan. I just want to thank everyone for coming and for our speakers today, and for Warwick, who did an enormous amount of work organizing this. This is our first in a webinar series that we will continue to have. If you're wondering why I'm the research lead, it's a really big, important question, because I'm not really sure either, because I'm not an expert in this area at all. However, I do work a lot in Métis and First Nations around issues of gender and cultural safety. And so I was very fortunate to partner with Dr. Lambert on this project. And the main focus of the project in the grant was to really look at the experience of people who are evacuated and what happens for our First Nations and Métis people in Saskatchewan, but beyond, in terms of where people go when they're evacuated and what happens in the evacuation experience. But we're so lucky that we are in some ways extending that more through a think tank that we hope to create of individuals who are experts in the area of emergency response and working in disaster relief. And so it's a new journey. We are occupying space that's already occupied, and I recognize that. And so we're hoping to be a resource and support through webinars and other means to support those who are working on the front lines, doing the really, really heavy lifting in this area. So as researchers, we are here to serve the Indigenous community and here to serve, you know, in the capacity that we humbly can. And so, so I want to turn it back over to Warwick and just say how happy I am to be involved in this. I also really want to, before I forget, is to recognize the Toronto Dominion Bank. And the bank funded this research, and it's such an important contribution. And so I just want to make sure that we acknowledge their support. And as researchers, it's always important to have support to do the work that we do. So I just want to, acknowledge where our funding comes from, and the role of the Toronto Dominion Bank in supporting it. So Warwick, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Tate. So today, we're going to be hearing from two presenters, and first, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Simon Lambert, and I'll just give a quick introduction here. Dr. Lambert is from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and is a member of the Tuho and Ngatani Ropani tribes. He'll correct this later, I'm sure. He became interested in disaster risk reduction and emergency management after the 2011 earthquakes in Christchurch. And since then, his research has focused on that for Indigenous communities, in particular urban Indigenous groups. He's also a member of the advisory board for the Pan American Health Organization's Indigenous Knowledge and Disaster Risk Reduction Network. After Dr. Lambert, we will hear from Dr. Lilia Yumagulova, and Dr. Yumagulova is a Bashkir Canadian interdisciplinary researcher specializing in disaster risk reduction and climate change displacement. She's the program director for Preparing Our Home, which is a program that empowers Indigenous youth leadership in emergency preparedness. Lilia has had the privilege of working with communities faced with some of the highest risk of disasters across Turtle Island. So we will have the presenters one after the other, and then we will open up for questions and discussions after. And as Fleur noted in the chat, you're welcome to post your questions during the presentations, and then we will address them once we've gone through both presentations. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Lambert.
Kia ora, Warwick, thank you for that. Kia ora tātou, he mihi aroha kia koutou. My name is Simon Lambert. My tribal affiliations are Te Tūhoe and Ngāti Ruapani, Aotearoa, New Zealand. You did a better job of pronouncing that, Warwick, than I do for any of the Indigenous names across North America. I'll start my presentation now, and there's a little bit more of I guess, a positioning statement, but a real pleasure to be here today. Dr. Yumagulova is actually the rock star in this space, and so I'll take as little time as I can to just give you some background on Indigenous disaster issues, and I'm sure a lot of what I'm talking about will be familiar in some way to many, if not all of you. The map there is, I just took that screenshot this morning. That's one of the many databases on disasters and emergencies you can find online. And the point I want to make with that is that most of these disasters and the evacuations from them and the recovery efforts towards trying to get communities back into some sort of position of safety and security is taking place on Indigenous territories. And even when those disasters or emergencies take place within an urban setting, that too is often Indigenous territory. And so I want to acknowledge on that the wonderful hosting by the peoples of Treaty 6 and by Métis for myself and my family when they were living in Saskatoon. I'm back in Aotearoa, New Zealand at the moment. COVID, et cetera, but looking to get back on the prairies very soon. There is my tribal territory, Waikirimoana. It's a lake in central North Island. Yes, it's beautiful. But again, want to point out, when you see landscape like that, you are looking at a hazard landscape. If you have steep slopes, if you have mountains, you'll have seismic activity. You have waters, there will be floods, there's landslides. The lake itself was formed by a very large landslide many hundreds of years ago. But it's beautiful. It's also subject to biosecurity incursions, which I also research, and I see them fitting within a broader disaster and emergency framework. This is the event that Warwick mentioned. This is the Christchurch earthquake, February 22nd, 2011. So we've just had the 11th anniversary of that, 185 deaths. And I have the hashtag up there. It is a Twitter account that basically seeks to reframe disasters. There's nothing natural about 185 people dying in an earthquake, 115 in the one building. It was poorly designed. It was renovated and overseen by an engineer who faked his credentials. There were people in there who had complained of the noises the building made after an earlier earthquake. They were dismissed. Many of them were middle-aged women who worked in the building. They knew something was wrong with it. Their concerns were dismissed. This space is gendered. They knew they were right, and they were dismissed by husbands, fathers, engineers. 115 deaths when it collapsed on this day. 30-something people were killed by falling masonry. And again, each one of those was preventable. So when we call a disaster natural, we actually pass over responsibility of that. It used to be to God or the gods, but these forces of nature, which we are in forever some sort of battle with. And Indigenous peoples have a different perspective on that. These are some of the questions I put out in a course that I teach, undergraduate course, International Indigenous Disaster Risk Reduction. So how do our communities frame hazard and risk and emergency and disaster? There's a cultural lens goes through how we interpret the world. You'll hear a lot of talk in this space on Indigenous knowledge. And I argue, how can we incorporate Western science into our knowledge systems? And that's an effort to stop our knowledge systems being incorporated by Western science. And also, and relevant to what we're talking about today, is what alliances are possible for our communities to make themselves safer, to reduce their risks. We know that wildfire is a hazard across the country now called Canada, particularly across northern Saskatchewan, as you can see there. We know that with climate change, we are seeing larger and more frequent wildfires, including up in the Arctic. And so we know that communities there are facing this now, and it can only increase. And they can't do it all on their own. It's no longer possible for anyone anywhere in a community to argue that what happens elsewhere doesn't matter and what you do doesn't matter. With global heating, it does matter. I'm sure you all woke up yesterday to the news of the latest horrific military action on the planet. And a little piece of your heart always has to go out to people whose lives are threatened in such a way. Our focus, our concern is our communities, Indigenous communities. We know that the authorities are often, wait for it, swamped with all the demands on their resources, their skills, and they themselves are constantly having to respond to emergencies. And we can't necessarily rely on them for all sorts of reasons, not least because sometimes these response peoples, these first responders, these services are actually racist. They're actually established in a racist setting. They undertake their work through their cultural lens, and that still puts our communities, our people, at severe risk. Public Safety Canada has a structure, has a hierarchy, has a way of addressing all these things at federal level, national level, territorial and provincial level, and down to municipalities, huge administrative structures and a large amount of money. But of course, when we talk about our communities again, worldwide, we know that Indigenous communities are not safe within these structures. Right? We have a great deal of work to do to ensure we get the most basic of respect. Here's a quick shot of the Emergency Planning Act from Saskatchewan. It's of interest now, given the latest protests in Ottawa. We have protests in Wellington at the moment. They always pull out a drum at your protests. and I gotta say, there was a Canadian flag flying at the New Zealand protests. I just took this picture yesterday. There's a camp set up here in Christchurch. And the main protests are up in Wellington. They've been going this is the third week now. A lot of Māori are present. I have a cousin who went there. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on. There's a lot of genuine concerns. I don't want to diminish that. But there's an edge to a lot of this that puts Indigenous peoples at greater risk. And so we know, and many of you will know, that the way these authorities deal with Indigenous protests, whether it's up in BC or on the Atlantic coast or downtown Saskatoon, there is a risk and a danger, and there's a use of planning acts and legislation such as this, where Indigenous peoples are almost by default seen as some sort of imminent situation, or there's the threat of terrorist activity. And there's something that the authorities will use to criminalize our protests and clamp down on it. So I'm actually quite nervous when federal powers and provincial powers are used to the extremes in protests, because ultimately we know that those will also be deployed on our communities. The main multilateral agreement to reduce disaster risks around the world through the United Nations is called the Sendai Framework. Came into being in 2015. It's to go to 2030. Don't bother reading all the text there. What it does do is just point out that we now have Indigenous knowledge acknowledged as part of the array of knowledges and practices to, quote, complement, end quote, scientific knowledges and disaster risk assessment. I'm always, again, a little nervous when we see our knowledges as in some way being clipped on to other knowledges, and it's always science, complementing some sort of better world that we're meant to benefit from. We need to be in control of this. Also, our peoples and the experience of our communities, the traditional ways of being, gives us some way to contribute to emergency planning, to evacuations, to so on. So the UNDRR platform, we have attended from Canada several times. Here is Todd Kuyak delivering the joint statement on behalf of Indigenous peoples in Geneva in 2017. He was the only one who had a suit, so he got the job. No, he's trilingual. He is experienced in the diplomatic arena and did an exemplary job. I've also hosted a small group in Geneva after that. Some of you, there's Todd again on the right. Next to him is Madeleine Redfern, who did 2 terms as mayor of Iqaluit. Very vocal proponent of Indigenous powers in disaster risk reduction, emergency management and evacuations. In the centre there is a friend and colleague of mine, Melanie Mark Shadbolt, who is very active now in the Indigenous biosecurity space. So the concerns over pests, diseases, zoonotic diseases that are infecting traditional prey species in northern Saskatchewan, for instance. These are more prevalent now with climate change. And so we see that as a part of the emergency response that our communities want to be a part of. And you do see, again, it's gendered, but there's more and more women involved in as first responders. They have particular skills that are absolutely vital in securing the safety of women and children, and often we see them to the forefront of securing the safety of elders. So I just want to acknowledge the role that women have as first responders. Of course, it's often a military-styled response we see, and that is problematic for many of our communities. I want to acknowledge too the work of the Prince Albert Grand Council. They have a highly skilled group of emergency responders and managers, Lauren Stewart, Tina Peltier. There's many others who have great support from Red Cross. So I acknowledge the work of Georgie Shearing, who's been very active again in supporting Indigenous first responders. And there's a number of reasons that Indigenous peoples should be to the forefront of emergencies. I list several of them there. Our communities know stuff. They have local knowledge. They know the risks, the vulnerabilities, they know the resources are available, and they know the strengths. They have local intel. They are able to implement culturally safe approaches to evacuation, to disaster risk reduction, right? To first response. And our communities, our knowledge keepers, knowledge holders, our elders, they're curious. They want to know more. And we have processes to learn more. We are not averse to innovation and change. We value and respect our traditions. We want to pass many of them on to our young people, but we are curious about the world. And elders and knowledge keepers ask questions. They want to know more. We're not averse to new technologies, new ways of doing things, but we want to appraise them through our frameworks. And ultimately, and where my research is going now, is that we see sovereignty as perhaps the ultimate requirement for ensuring the safety of our peoples, that we have our own ways of adjudicating what's a risk, what's a hazard, and how we should mitigate that. And this is just some work that I'm also doing at the moment. What are the conditions? Who calls it an emergency? When's an emergency over? Who's in control? Where are the borders? When's it all over? They tell me that COVID's over in Saskatchewan. Awesome. Who's in charge of these decisions, and are they making them for the best interests of our communities? That's all from me. As I say, Dr. Yumagulova is, she's the main act. I was the curtain raiser. Just wanted to thank you again for listening. It's always an honor, always a pleasure and a privilege. Kia ora, Caroline. The girls here miss you. And yes, very much want to get up to Elk Ridge, and if it's summer, play golf, and if it's winter, do some cross-country skiing. Kia ora tātou.
Simon, thank you so much. Really grateful to be joining all of you today. I'm joining you from the beautiful lands of the Osoyoos Indian Band. I'm at Inkamip this morning, and really grateful to be sharing this space. I saw some familiar names in the participants list, and just really honored to be co-presenting here with Dr. Simon Lambert, and to be invited by Dr. Carolyn Tate, and all the work that Warwick has put into organizing this. So since I'm at Inkamip on the Osoyoos Indian Band lands today, I will be using actually some photos from here, from our past events that we've organized on these beautiful lands. Today I'm speaking as a researcher, and I will also be drawing on the work that I've been doing with the Preparing Our Home program, which is, as Lambert kindly, Simon kindly introduced, is an Indigenous-led program by the youth for their communities in building up emergency management capacity. So I love this photo. I often start with this photo. On this photo, you can see Ashiel Thomas of Hausut First Nation, so Inuktitut youth, and Stokemy Smith of a Blackfoot youth from Siksika Nation. So this is the spirit, I think, that Indigenous women bring to collaboration in the space of emergency management. So Ashel does water safety work in a Hausut, which is remote Indigenous community, Inuktitut community, and Stokemy is a liaison in emergency social services, ESS as we call it, at the city of Strathmore for Indigenous population in Alberta. Right. Before I begin, I would like to introduce myself. I think it's very important for us Indigenous peoples of the world to introduce themselves. And I'm really grateful for some of the introductions that were put in the chat. Welcome everyone from all the different worlds and places that we represent. So in terms of us disaster scholars, as Simon said, we tend to look at the world in terms of disasters, right? So this black dot right here, which was a meteorite impact, on the land now known as Russian Federation, is actually where my peoples are from. So Bashkir peoples are the people of the Ural Mountains. We're colorful people. We are people of great history. First and foremost, we're people of the horse. So we, for example, fermented horse milk is one of our drinks. We are wild honey beekeepers. So we have relationship with the land and the species that have carried on through the millennia. And one specific thing, since today we're focusing on gender, I wanted to introduce this piece that I'm wearing today, which is something that a Bashkir woman would wear on her chest when she would welcome guests, or for example, in an emergency, if you had to get up and evacuate very quickly, for example, if unfriendly people were coming, or if there was a fire. So you can see here the lady at the bottom photo wearing it. We also have ribbon skirts, so on and so forth. So it's a rich culture. And in our language, the words for homeland is Yerhu, which means land and water. So in our language, we carry the notion of the relationship to the land. And the woman carries the wealth and the responsibility that the family has. This was not, though, the reality that I grew up with. So this is my home community, where flood was just a way of life, but floods came and go. It was the poverty and oppression from the state that stayed. So I think that's very important, the point that Simon made. What is natural about the disasters that we faced with? And how is that even natural when we think about climate context, all right? But first we need to think about colonization process and then a natural disaster of that has brought all the impacts on the Indigenous communities around the world. As Simon mentioned, currently in terms of global framework, we have several really exciting things happening. So the Sendai framework was really significant. As Simon mentioned in his presentation, it was the first time where Indigenous peoples are included, solid and true, right? So we matter in the process of global disaster risk reduction. That's very important. But they also realized that's not enough. Just including Indigenous peoples can bring with itself the patriarchy, for example, that's currently is seen across communities without the acknowledging the traditional roles that women had within the communities. So one of the other graphics that I've included here is the intersectionality wheel, which is Kimberly Crenshaw work, a beautiful work on acknowledging that if you are a woman and a Black woman, your experience is different than if you're just a woman or a Black person, right? Same in Indigenous communities. If you are a woman or a young girl or a two-spirited person, your experiences are different. So acknowledging all of this in the spectrum of colonialism, sexism, ableism, so on and so forth is really important when we look at designing culturally safe emergency management services. I also wanted to talk a little bit briefly. There are these global frameworks, but behind them are people. So I wanted to introduce you to Margareta Wallström, the remarkable woman that was behind the leader as head of the UN ISDR behind the Sendai framework. So when I interviewed her a few years ago, this was in 2015, about the Sendai framework, what she talked about, what she's seen as the biggest hazard, in addition to all the natural hazards and so on and so forth, is this short-term thinking, which is entirely counterintuitive to building and planning for resilience. So as she said, when we discussed Sendai in the early days, I tried to inject the idea that this framework needed to be a 40-year framework. Most professionals agreed with her, but 15 years is what became politically viable. I know there are many organizations joining today. It's something for us to think about. What is the temporal dimension? What kind of time horizons do we bring when we plan for resilience in Indigenous communities? Because they bring much longer horizons, right? So either through the medicine wheel or the planning for 7 generations framework, there are other Indigenous models of resilience that are fundamentally different. And the other point that I wanted to make today is that the impacts will be highly inequitable. So in Margareta's words, as she said, this obsession with 2 degrees that we have, it takes away from the fact that 2 degrees is an average. And in some parts of the world, the increase will be 9 degrees. It will be inhabitable. So it's really important for us to start planning for the displacement aspect and often it will be those who have caused the least amount of climate change and those who have been marginalized for the longest time that will have to move. How can we do it in a more equitable way? So I'm really grateful today also to be able to share some of the lessons from the Preparing Our Home, which is a youth-led solutions-focused community resilience program. Some of the core tenets, how we do our work. So it's based on Indigenous science. It's land-based learning is at the core of the program. Youth leadership is the driver. Its focus is on intergenerational planning, so elders and youth working together. The core of the program is really capacity building, technical training in emergency management, but really it is carried by peer mentoring. So people supporting each other and uplifting each other. And again, I just wanted to share this photo, which is from these lands as well, where I am today, because it really brings together the sentiment, the spirit behind the program. So this is Evan Tucci Jr. in a Chalmers youth holding hands with a Blackfoot elder, Darlene Yellow Woman Monroe, at one of our gatherings. One of the photos here, this is oil spill training in a Hausut First Nation. This is actually from Lac La Ronge, I believe, a photo that Michelle Vanderwoord visited Sheena Charles in Stanley Mission. This is an event that was facilitated by Preparing Our Home, the learning. And this is in Lillooet, British Columbia. So the mapping that was done. And as part of this work, we're fortunate to kind of raise and elevate Indigenous community voices within the larger realm of narrative, publications, and so on and so forth. So this is one of the reports that was written by, so we had a Siksika member, a Matagami First Nation member, and the Confederacy of the Mainland Mi'kmaq. And it's called Building Climate Resilience in First Nation Communities. I will provide the links after the talk with the presentation, so you're welcome to check it out. And basically, some of the things that we talked about is the deep inequities in which First Nations emergency management and Indigenous emergency management operates. As we know, some of the statistics that Todd Kuyak at the time, and Algonquin leader that Simon talked about, when he was with the Emergency Management Assistance Program, they looked at the statistics nationally, right? And it's so important to have Indigenous peoples within these spaces at the government. So his team found out that Indigenous peoples are 33 living on reserve are 33 times more likely to be evacuated due to wildfire, 18 times more likely to be evacuated due to any type of disasters. And then some of the data and the work that Michelle Vanderwoord has been doing, a Cree woman who is the first president of the Aboriginal Firefighters Association, and she will be presenting the next webinar. I highly recommend you attend it. She's incredibly eloquent, and the work that she does is beyond inspiring. So some of the inequities that she's working with is that Indigenous people's fire fatalities are 10 times higher than the kind of, non-Indigenous peoples. A fifth of Indigenous residential properties are exposed to risks in 1 to 100-year flooding. So there are multiple risks that are defining the context of emergency management. As Simon though mentioned, what is an emergency is one of those things that in every Preparing Our Home workshop we begin talking about. So for some communities, it's the suicide epidemics, especially among youth. For some communities, it is the disappearance and loss of language, because with that you lose your identity. For some communities, it's the loss of someone as the spirit and the culture that has sustained. So I think Indigenous peoples, when we talk about self-determination, it's so important that they define what is an emergency to them. and they built the program around that to address this emergency. The other important point is that there are multiple decisions to be made and very difficult trade-offs when we look at the multiple risks, because it's never just the flood. It could be a flood, for example, it could be a flood and a pandemic and overdose events, right? So it's always layered, multiple risks. So for example, if we talk about mobility continuum and evacuations, women fleeing domestic violence in disasters, right? If you have limited access to transportation, if your partner, for example, already put his name down in one of the evacuation centers, so there are, if as the weather gets worse, or for example, in wildfires or winter extreme events in the winter and cold, there are many different things that a woman has to, difficult, dangerous decisions that she has to make to move with the decision to leave or to stay, right? So, and also obviously some of the conflict that for practitioners that are doing from BC that know really well around staying behind to protect the land, because the firefighting system is really protecting the structures, but it's the land and the connection, multiple connections, intergenerational connections that get lost if the land is burned. So some of the work that we've done with Darlene Yumagulova and Dr. Emily Deakin, a Métis scholar, Cree Métis scholar, was on looking at long-term evacuations. So what are some of the impacts? Because there's been a lot of work. Amy Christensen, Dr. Amy Christensen will be joining for the third seminar. They've done exceptional work on evacuations, in First Nation evacuations. So, but we looked at a question that few people have looked at, and this was funded by the National Coordinating Centers for Public Health. What happens to people that have been displaced for a long time? So in Siksika Nation, for example, 6.5 years, people were gone from their homes. What are their experiences like? So it was a very hard, difficult work, and it was led by Darlene Yumagulova, who is a former nurse in the community and a former chief. And she started as a volunteer in a kind of, large gym where all evacuees were put, about 1,000 people that were evacuated in the event. So she started as a volunteer, and out of that came a Dancing Deer Disaster Recovery Centers, which she managed for several years following the recovery. As always, any emergency manager knows, number one, in any after action report, it's always communication challenge, right? So there were numerous. So for example, posting information on Facebook only, something that elders cannot access. There were numerous health impacts, uneven impacts within the community. So people with disabilities or chronically ill or single parents, they experience the events very differently, as do women in general. And just the significance of home for identity, security, and belonging. So for example, one single mother had a child with a Down syndrome, and every time after she would pick them up after school, she had to explain that we can't go home, right? So here's the quote: "My child has Down syndrome. My children are used to a lot of structure. The flood threw us out of our routine. It was stressful for them, stressful to teach them and help them understand that we don't have a home anymore." Another impact on residential school survivors, that's one of the residential school survivors said, when you're grabbed from your home, put on a bus, and shoved away and put on cots in this large institutional environment, it is like residential school all over again. So how can we design safer spaces? And I must say, like in BC, a lot of work has been done on cultural safety, but there is always huge amounts of room for improvement. Some of other things that change in disasters: increased substance use, addictions, domestic violence, again, impacting women and children significantly. Real trauma of isolation, inadequate temporary accommodation. So if you're moved around from one hotel to another, RV, so on and so forth, it's really wears you down, right? So, and some of the evacuees were placed in these ATCO trailers, which are buildings used for temporary workers on the oil sands, for example, or transmounting. You can see them. We were just driving like many of these trailers. So they're not designed around families. They're designed around single guys coming from work, sleeping and going to bed, right? So these are the kind of spaces where evacuees was placed, and nobody felt safe, right? Like, so the design of the space, it increased violence and safety. simply put, as one of the participants said, I just felt like I'm in prison here. And within all of this, an incredible institution, Darlene, here she is in the middle, Darlene Yellow Woman Monroe, they created Dancing Deer Disaster Recovery Center. It has deep spiritual meaning for the peoples, Siksika peoples. And what they did is they went around to meet these people. If you're in RV, if you're in a hotel, so they went to reach out. They were the boots and the eyes and the heart on the ground, reaching out to these evacuees throughout several years, delivering multidisciplinary services where a youth worker, a psychologist, and a nurse, for example, would visit people in their home. So they didn't need to pick themselves up and go somewhere. They would come to them instead. And I just wanted to read out this quote here, that meeting the people in their temporary situations, people were much more open to be seen. For the most part, it allowed for a lot more trust building, that people would be willing to open their doors to you, to be able to be seen in that situation. Rather than them seeing you as a psychologist or a professional coming to do counseling, they saw me more as somebody coming to visit and checking in on them. It's a much safer, non-intrusive way. So the services were also delivered in Blackfoot language, which is also really important culturally safe practice. And I just want to raise my hands for the work that's been going on in Prince Albert Grand Council, the really incredible work to build up the Indigenous capacity, to have the volunteer drives and so on. It's really exceptional. And I look forward to learning more about that work. So in terms of intersectional approaches, it's becoming a buzzword, and that's always very dangerous because that sometimes it's a form of oppression, right? Like we suddenly want to know this different diverse perspectives. What do people with disabilities feel like in emergencies? What does single mom feels like? Or what is if it's a single mom with disability with children with disabilities, right? So we need to be very careful how we apply that. So some of the examples of the work that we did in British Columbia, and where this is coming from is basically the federal government mandated gender-based analysis plus in the policies, so it's kind of trickling down. Another context in BC, we've signed up to UN DRIP, so there is actually an act that's implementing Indigenous rights, Declaration of Indigenous Rights, and there will be a secretariat being created, which was an announcement just made a few days in the budget, right? So some of the ways, so the way this study was done, basically, there was a kind of a census-based quantitative component. Then there were interviews with non-Indigenous people that experienced disasters. And then there was an Indigenous circle of experts. So that's the part that I led. And throughout it, people shared their experiences of how those multiple intersecting identities, how can they show up in this space? And the really important message from that is that we really need to look at Indigenous capacities. So often the narrative is really centers around deficits. How do we center on the capacities, the strengths, the powers, as Simon called them? Another amazing project is Indigenous Community Safety Partnership Program, led by Gina Nagano of the House of Wolf Associates. So that program works on the Yukon to reclaim Indigenous community safety using traditional law. Again, I can share some links around that. And the work that I will be doing for my postdoctoral work that I've started a long time ago now, we are here to stay project, really looking at self-determination in climate displacement. Some of the outcomes of the work so far have really been around culturally safe evacuation guidelines and disaster relief services across continuum of care throughout displacement. And I think that's really, really important. At the core of this work is really community-led approach. So what are some of the things that we're hearing? There is a strong need for trauma-informed approach. And it, again, dangerous with it becoming the buzzword. What does it look? Indigenous peoples need to define what does this look like. We can't look at emergency management in isolation. We really need to look at food security, housing, community care, and uplifting Indigenous youth leadership, which are all the things that this project, this TD-funded project, is looking to do. The other thing we need to acknowledge is this is Leona Humchit, who is a Hetzuk counselor. As she said, for 700 generations, we have been doing long-term and sustainable management of our lands. Let's embed that in this work, right? So we really need to look at emergency management in the context of climate change as well. So, and youth are best positioned to lead that. The incredible Indigenous youth that's standing strong on their feet. when we look at that as well, it's so important to focus on the traditional economies where women played a huge role. So fisheries or other things, women played a huge role. So what does that look like, and what elements need to inform today? Matriarchal governance systems, really centering on that, intersectional impacts of climate change and domestic violence, again, looking at those points of intersections, how is it impacting different people different? And finally, of course, need for equal roles for women in decision-making at all levels, really working hard on creating those spaces. So for example, if you're creating a project, how can you ensure that there is an Indigenous woman on your board, that she's properly compensated for her time, the knowledge, and the wisdom that she brings, right? So those are some of the questions that we need to tackle. So, and just as a concluding slide, I just wanted to bring in the beautiful people of Preparing Our Home, the leaders from across Turtle Island. And I also wanted to bring in my great-grandma. So great-grandma's seen massive challenges in her life. My grandpa was removed as an enemy of the state because he was practicing self-government, Indigenous self-government. So she had to bring up 6 children on her own. She was sent to mining camps and so on and so forth. So just want to really acknowledge and celebrate that the strength that Indigenous women bring. And this is a quote from a work that we did with a group of Indigenous women. There is a general recommendations for reducing discrimination in OCHA, one of the OCHA initiatives, the UN initiative as well. And we were really concerned that throughout the document, Indigenous women were presented as victims. The language was really around deficit-based victim approach. So we made some recommendations. It's a short document that I can send a link to as well. And here's what we said, that Indigenous women and girls are foundational to family, community, governance, and social well-being as life givers, water carriers, knowledge keepers, professionals, and leaders. As life givers, Indigenous women are the connection between family, community, and lands and waters. And Indigenous women and girls ensure that the responsibilities to future generations and to the universe and all relations are met. So I just wanted to end at this slide and say, the way we say goodbye when we part is Haubolgus, which says, be healthy. And that's what I wish to all of you and your families, be healthy. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you, Simon, both for those wonderful presentations. Now is the time for questions and discussion. So we do have one question in the chat, but if you are wanting to unmute, please do so, and you can ask your questions and see if we can get some discussion. Yes, Charlotte, feel free.
Hey, thanks so much for acknowledging that. Yeah, I did put a question in the chat here. Just curious about the best ways to reach people who are not connected to technology, to the internet, especially when it has to do with alerting and evacuation particularly in rural areas. One thing that I know about is shortwave radio. I don't know how prevalent that is among the First Nations in Canada, but I know somewhat in the United States it is. So if there's anything like that, just ideas that where people who don't have that good access can still, get the good messages that they need.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a good answer, but I do know that recently, maybe it was before COVID, evacuations from wildfires up in North Saskatchewan, the actual maps that the provincial first responders had did not list or did not note all the cabins that people were staying in, often just short-term for hunting purposes. And it was actually down to PAGC responders to track down people and let them know what was going on. But of course, with the wildfire, the people there, they know what's going on. They were aware of it, but I guess with the official first responders and provincial level, they are learning to coordinate better with on-the-ground knowledge. But it's a good point you raised that so often we found this with remote delivery of lectures. The university rolls out online delivery on the assumption and expectation that 100% of the student body has the hardware and the software and the connectivity. And we know that that simply is not the case. So the digital divide is a serious issue. We do not have access to the most up-to-date technologies, and they're expensive, and often they come with strings attached. So again, having that cultural lens of how do Indigenous communities define and decide on their hazard landscape and what they want to prioritize. But also I see you noted the issue of financial abuse as well. That is a significant issue, and I'm hearing some pretty horrific stories of relationships ending and the way the finances are then used against women and children.
I just wanted to say that in some communities that we work with, there are really solid communication pathways. Like one of the communities that's very remote, they have VHS radios, right? So when a child goes missing or something, they say that on the radio and the entire community listens in. So it's really unique and really important to understand how the messages and how information flows within the community. And then for the outsiders, the emergency management, evacuation officers, and so on and so forth, to work with that. And just to your point, it's often the most contentious point in terms of actual notifications. We've seen it through the atmospheric river events in BC. Indigenous communities weren't notified on time. And this is just something that's continuing year after year after year. So as an interjurisdictional issue in terms of fixing those communication pathways so people know, that's critically important. And it's not just the technical issue, it's also the power dynamics within. So I think there is a lot to consider and unpack there. Thank you for that question.
Yes, Dr. Tate.
Yeah, so great presentations. Thank you very much, you guys. I have a question about COVID-19 and COVID-19 presented all kinds of challenges, particularly I know in our north, in terms of access to healthcare and access to other things that people needed. And so it was a stay in place type of natural disaster, right? Or if we can call it that. So people were staying in place, and we certainly didn't have the type of housing we needed for people to isolate in that. And so it was a challenge locally for people. But can you talk about, or do you know in terms of, and I open this up to everybody who's here, is, the question of like what happened during evacuations with COVID-19 and the need for people to isolate or the need for people to social distance, and then where people were evacuated to. Is there any research yet that's really that has looked at the experience of people, or do you know what the challenges were, if any, that were new presented because of the pandemic?
I was waiting for Lily to say something.
I'm waiting for maybe participants to share. I think this is a beautiful opportunity. Yeah. Maybe if people have thoughts or ideas or how that was handled in their jurisdictions, I think that would be a great time to do a bit of sharing as well. It's a real question, right? When your housing is not in any way designed, and the multi-generational families and the overcrowding and this kind of shelter in place, how did that play out? Maybe some people have some feedback on how that worked in where you come from.
Okay, well, I saw Charlotte first, or Carol, if you'd like to.
I'm happy to let Charlotte go first. That's okay.
Thank you, everybody. Not to keep jumping in, but just real quick, as far as when it comes to housing and COVID impacts, I live in Philadelphia and work as an EMS provider, and I've seen a lot of people go through a whole course of treatment of COVID and go in the hospital, out of the hospital, intubated, extubated, and then they get home and the case manager has no idea what their home looks like. They don't know that they've got 2 flights of stairs up. They don't know that there's nobody there to help them with oxygen, things like that. So I'm not sure if it's the most relevant point, but I think there's just like a disconnect between once treatment is done and then knowing where people are going back to and that where they live has enough support for them to continue their recovery.
Thanks, Charlotte. And Carol?
Yeah. I'm just going to venture in here from an observational perspective, because I indicated in the chat that I'm currently doing some field work, and it's been interesting to talk to many people about their reactions to COVID-19. And where I am now, a lot of the families a lot of the settlements are intergenerational. And but what is consistent among the 3 generations is an incredible distrust for the authorities. And if the authorities suggest something, as in shelter in place, stay where you are, but maintain certain distance, it is highly disregarded. It's very interesting, this conversation around communications and authentication of the communications, and really understanding where those messages are coming from, because there is a large proportion of the population here that during Hurricane Irma, and this was also seen in Lewis 20 years ago, or would be 25 now, and in COVID-19, is that there is such a strong distrust between the state authorities and information coming from state authorities and what the communities do. They will often rely on religious leaders and what the religious leaders will say. And if the religious leaders are aligned with the state, there might be a little more behavior accommodation. If they're not aligned with the opinion of the state, then there's absolutely no room for reconciliation. So that's just based on my limited observations here in my field. But I'm sure that there's an awful lot of I see an awful lot of parallels with what's been said to what I'm seeing here. And I could go on and on about the dynamic between genders, between men and women, and information coming from men and women, and the acceptance of information between men and women, especially in such a matriarchal society here.
Thanks, Carol. Do we have any other questions? Give you a few more seconds to decide if you've got anything pressing you want to ask. Now's the time.
Just a comment as well, just to welcome anybody to share some space. And if you're uncomfortable, as Warwick said, uncomfortable with being recorded, it's totally possible to edit this out. So really, this is space for you to share and to be heard and to participate. So thank you for anyone stepping.
And I'll maybe jump in a little bit here. And, so part of the work, the reason behind the work that we're doing is to, is that we see people being evacuated to sites in Saskatchewan, so I can only speak here, and the great effort that goes on into making people comfortable and having appropriate places for people to be evacuated to. So I know there's a great amount of effort put into it. That being said, is there a possibility for a social enterprise type of response as well, right? So there seems to be a lot of money. Our people, so I'm a Métis person, and our First Nations, we talk often about the political economy around Indigenous, if we want to call it suffering, right? Or Indigenous issues that come up. And in this context, there seems to be a lot of resources flowing at any given time. And so is there the possibility of a social enterprise that's Indigenous people or First Nations people or Métis people looking after Métis people, First Nations people, so that we see that as people are going through this horrible, horrific time of being evacuated, that we could actually make this into a positive experience where people could potentially, in their evacuation experience, come away with something very meaningful. And is there a way that we could create spaces where we have Indigenous people looking after Indigenous people and supporting Indigenous people and offering things, for instance, that maybe if they live in a remote region that they don't have during, at home, but they could be introduced to positive cross-cultural experiences, for instance, with people who are in the South, so oftentimes many of the people in the North, they may not get out of the North, for instance, to ever visit a Southern First Nations or to ever visit, Métis people in the South. And there are vast cultural differences. So is there a possibility in the context that we're working to turn this into something that it does have a meaning associated with it, different than being evacuated out of your community and housed till you go home?
So Carol, I saw you had your hand up. I don't know if you want to respond to Caroline or if you had a different point.
No, I had a separate point, and it was a question for Simon. And with regards to beginning and ends, but I'll wait for people to respond to Caroline's first.
So I think that what Caroline has raised is an interesting comment, especially because in some of the reading that I've done on emergency response and emergency management, especially when it comes to cultural safety, is this idea that should hotels be receiving funding or be hosting guests if they haven't taken cultural safety training or some similar ideas. So if we can have people that are more able to understand the cultures and contexts in which these evacuees are coming from, if they can participate in these economies, I think that's something that would be beneficial to both parties for sure. And that's Simon's mentioned that there is some research on some of these activities. So one is called the Res Cross, and you can, if you do a little bit of searching, you'll find that information. So there are examples where this is happening, but it's very much not something that's been formal, and certainly is a space for some development going forward. And I think that's something that we're going to be looking at with our work to kind of fill that space.
Yeah, and the Res Cross ruffled some feathers of the Red Cross because it's territorial, right? The official responders expect and assume authority in that space, and what they did up at Beardy's or Comasis, which is about an hour's drive north of Saskatoon. They simply hosted their own relations and friends and community members as they were evacuated for wildfire. And one of the tricks to making people feel better is comfort food. I know here at the Christchurch earthquakes, Red Cross and others provided beautifully nutritionally balanced foods for evacuees, i.e. lots of salad. Hint, people don't want salad in a disaster response. People want, you want your comfort food, and there's no need to go on a health binge in the days or weeks after a disaster. It's just, let's just feel good for this hour, for this day, for tonight, for this meal. So, and again, it's kind of obvious, but again, how do we get to influence the plans and the tools by which our communities are treated? Because we know, and the story from the Red Cross was that they actually had sturgeon provided for them, and elders were reluctant to return home too early because they knew that sturgeon was on the meal again for the next day. So it's that people talk about food, they talk about the meals. The meals are important, and so that's something that communities provide, because we all know that. But Carol, you had a question for me.
Yes, I did. And let me just lower my hand here. Some of the rhetorical questions that you presented at the end of your, that you asked at the end of your presentation are the same questions, or similar questions that I'm dealing with. And I think that within the context of this conversation, it is very relevant. And I think also within the context of a rapidly changing climate, especially important. When do disasters begin and when do they end? And especially it's the ending part. And then if you layer on the issue of the power dynamics that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, and understanding what the word disaster and what the word end and what the word beginning represents in the through the translations, the cultural translations and the linguistic translations, how do you answer that? How do we know it's over, and who's in charge of saying it's over, and should we let somebody be in charge? So maybe these are more rhetorical questions that, you know, we're edging towards a Friday evening, and I'm sure I will drive my husband crazy at a Saturday night. At Saturday night dinner, I'll be asking these questions. But yeah, please elaborate.
Oh,
that would be great to hear from you.
The temporal aspect of disasters and emergencies fascinates me, because I mean, climate change, when did that start? You know, when we started burning coal, when did we started doing jet travel? I mean, when does it end? So we know now that Pacific Island communities are being evacuated from their islands permanently, and some of them are going to other islands. Some of them are coming to New Zealand, Auckland, Sydney, LA. You know, there's a big Samoan community in LA. And so what do they lose? They lose their lands. Do they then own the ocean territory around those shores? Because at the moment, yes, but when the land disappears, this is kind of a grey zone in international law. They already have tuna fisheries just riding roughshod over a lot of Pacific Island waters anyway. So there's all these really sort of, you know, constitutional questions about who people are and where they are and what are their rights and so on. And that's been going on for many, many years. And it's just the time span to make a decision is becoming shorter and shorter. And then is their disaster over when they given or buy a house in Sydney? Or are they sitting there just traumatized because their cemeteries have gone, because they're, you know, all that they grew up with is gone. It just doesn't exist anymore. I argue that colonization was the start. It was the uber disaster for Indigenous peoples, and we're still recovering from that. Because the other thing is that people want to, from the response to the recovery. And a lot of people just simply want you to shut up about your disaster. There's not a lot of sympathy necessarily for traumatized people. And here we noticed with the earthquakes, within 6 months, people were saying around the country, oh, are you still going on about that earthquake? You'd still have aftershocks. You'll have aftershocks for many, many years after a big earthquake. And you just run out of sympathy, disaster fatigue. The insurance companies want it over, right? The governments want it over. The planners, the regional councils, they want it over. They just want everyone to get back to some sort of normality. Human brain, human body, communities don't work like that. And so, and also we have cascading disasters, COVID, over top of hurricane evacuation, over the top of heat wave in BC this past summer. They don't just come one at a time and then one ends and then you get a bit of a breather and then the next one starts. And again, the time to recover and discuss and do something about it seems to become shorter and shorter. And community leaders, just on a tangent to that, it's the same people having to be in the decision-making space for emergencies, for water supply, for education. You know, you go to the town hall meetings, it's the same people turn up all the time, and they are exhausted. There's a great fear around the world that once COVID is somehow over, that a lot of people just step out of the health space. They don't want to be an emergency nurse anymore. They don't want to be a frontline person anymore. It's just been too hard for them. And I think we're going to have a real issue over resourcing the next one, because people will go, oh, geez, don't want to go there again. So, and we have the conversations as we're having here now. I'm yet to see any great traction for any communities in the administrative, the behemoth that is a modern day bureaucracy.
I just wanted to add to that important point, Carol, in terms of, so what Simon just mentioned, right? Some people will never recover, right? Like, and that's what was very clear in Siksika case study. Some people will never recover. Darlene pushed really hard on using any word like resilience or anything like that. And same, Dine Matriarch, so Rose Whitehair, who was an emergency manager for the Navajo First Nation. We have a paper coming out, building actually on Simon's and John Scott's work on Indigenous people's role in DRR. And it says straight and true that we need to use caution when using word resilience to describe people in the systems that were designed to maintain the inequities within. So that point on language is critical. Then how we name people, right? Like, for example, stakeholders is wrong language to use. These are rights holders we're talking about, right? So acknowledging that power dynamic within is very critical. And there are a few of those kind of language things we can really, it's nominal change that introduces massive opening of space in reclaiming that power. So I think, thank you very much for bringing that up. Language is very important. And then we have another program, project on Indigenous languages. And I hope while I'm at USask, I can work with Randy more. And some languages don't have words for disasters, because just that kind of like, as Simon showed that beautiful landscape, and she said, us hazards people see hazards, but people just saw what you needed to adapt to, right? So the Indigenous languages and the richness they bring in worldviews and philosophies, so important, finding the right words to describe the right relationship and situating it in the context of rights, responsibilities, and all relations. So I think, thank you for making that very important comment, really important.
Thank you. I thank you for your kindness, Lily. One of the things that preoccupies me in disaster studies is what I would call Western oppression on cultural adaptations. So you have a Western approach of disaster risk response or hazard response or recovery amongst people in communities and cultures around the world that don't see disaster in the same way, don't understand. We don't even communicate at the same level. So as an anthropologist, I found this webinar incredibly interesting. And thank you so much, Lily, and thank you so much, Simon. I think your commentary has been outstanding, and I'm hoping I can get the recording so that I can do a transcript and be able to take advantage of it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Carol and Lily and Simon for that discussion. Are there any other questions? Any other comments?
I just put the comment in the chat there, Warwick, that we need more social scientists, anthropologists, human geographers, which is my discipline, and less geoscientists. I'm often in meetings or conferences where it's dominated by geophysical scientists, engineers, and so on, and they're talking about people, and they're talking about behavior change, which we used to call social engineering, and yet they're doing it from the position of an engineer. Like, surely the people will realize that they can't live there any longer because it's going to flood. Therefore, either build a seawall or you blah, 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 blah. You have all these technical solutions to problems. I think we need engineers, but bless them, a lot of them aren't people. A lot of them are they come across very stiff, very difficult people to engage with, and yet they dominate the funding, they dominate the research, they dominate the discourse, the policy, the decision making. Governments love engineers in these situations, and yet these are societal issues, societal problems, and culture is all through that. Absolutely.
We also see Lily tagging onto that, boosting Dr. Tate. Caroline is a medical anthropologist by training, and so this has been a great conversation. Thank you all for coming and participating. And we'll, as Lily mentioned earlier, we will have another webinar coming up March 11th. I'll just bring it up here. If you're not already registered for it, you can do so through Eventbrite. You can also, so that webinar is March 11th. It's going to be an hour earlier at 12 o'clock Central Standard Time. If you'd like to find out more about what we are up to, you can visit our webpage here. It's got a short URL here, bit.ly/TD-TIER-1, or you can visit us on Facebook. The webinar will be posted once we've processed it. We'll post it on both of those, so you'll be able to come back and listen to it again if there was anything that you wanted to brush up on. Otherwise, thank you again for coming. Thank you to the presenters. It's been wonderful. And there, Fleur has the link for our Facebook page in the chat. And I hope that we will see you at the next webinar. Thanks, everyone.